He vanished without a trace, blocking his family, flying overseas with someone new, and checking into a luxury hotel to escape the noise. But just as he stepped into the lobby, every screen lit up with a live stream. His daughter's voice, calm and sharp, began revealing secrets he thought were buried forever. In that moment, silence turned into exposure, and the man who wanted to disappear became the center of a story the world couldn't ignore. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's jump into the story. The rain had stopped just moments before Leonard Hale stepped out of the black car. The pavement outside Rosevale Manor Hotel still shimmered with moisture, reflecting the soft glow of lanterns lining the entrance. Leonard adjusted the collar of his coat and glanced at Maris Fern, who stood beside him, her eyes scanning the grand facade of the building. She said nothing, and neither did he. Silence had become their shared language. The hotel was known for its quiet elegance. No flashy signs, no crowds, just polished wood, muted gold accents, and the scent of aged tea drifting from the lobby. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear. Leonard had chosen it for that reason. He had blocked his wife's number, ignored his daughter's messages, and booked the suite under a different name. He wanted peace, and he believed this was where he would find it. As they entered, the concierge greeted them with a warm smile. His name tag read Tomas, and his voice was calm, practiced, and polite. He offered a welcome drink, gestured toward the elevator, and handed over the room key with a quiet nod. Everything was smooth, just as Leonard had hoped. But then, something shifted. The television screens in the lobby, which had been playing soft music and scenic views, flickered. One by one, they changed. The image was grainy at first, then sharpened. A live stream appeared. The voice that followed was unmistakable. October 3rd, Flight 217, Room 604. You thought I wouldn't know. Leonard froze. Maris turned toward the screen. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed like a stone. It was Ivy Hale, Leonard's daughter. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't crying. She was simply speaking. You left without a word, but silence doesn't erase truth. The lobby grew quiet. Guests paused. Tomas looked unsure, glancing between the screens and Leonard. The stream continued. Ivy listed dates, locations, and moments. Each one matched Leonard's recent movements. It was clear she had been watching, not out of anger, but out of resolve. Leonard's hand tightened around the room key. Maris stepped back, her expression unreadable. The stream wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was precise. Ivy spoke like someone who had rehearsed, not to perform, but to be heard. You taught me how to disappear. Now I'm showing you how to be seen. Leonard turned away from the screens and walked toward the elevator. Maris followed, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected their faces. Leonard looked older than he had earlier that day. Maris looked distant. Neither spoke. When they reached the suite, the door opened to a room filled with soft light and quiet luxury. Velvet chairs, a fireplace, and a view of the sea. It was everything Leonard had paid for. But the television in the room was already on. Ivy's stream played there too. Leonard sat down slowly. Maris remained standing. Ivy's voice continued. This isn't revenge. It's remembrance. The words echoed through the room. Leonard didn't move. He didn't reach for the remote. He didn't try to turn it off. He just listened. Outside, the waves crashed gently against the shore. Inside, the truth unfolded in real time. The quiet arrival he had planned was no longer quiet. The peace he had purchased was no longer peaceful. And the silence he had chosen was no longer his to control. The story had begun, not with confrontation, but with clarity. And Leonard Hale, once hidden behind wealth and distance, was now exactly where he never expected to be. Scene. This was only the beginning. The suite was quiet, but not in the way Leonard Hale had hoped. The soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of waves outside the window were drowned out by the voice coming from the television. Ivy Hale's live stream continued, her tone steady and composed. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't angry. She was simply telling the truth. Leonard sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, his hands resting on his knees. Maris Fern stood near the window, her arms crossed, watching the reflection of the screen in the glass. The room was filled with luxury. Crystal lamps, silk curtains, and a view of the sea, but none of it mattered now. The silence he had paid for had been broken. Ivy's voice echoed through the room. You left on September 21st. You booked the flight under a different name. You checked into this hotel thinking no one would notice. Leonard closed his eyes. He had planned everything carefully. He had wanted distance, not drama. But Ivy had found him, not by chasing, but by observing. She had turned his escape into a story, and now the world was listening. The stream showed images, photos of Leonard at airports, receipts from restaurants, even a blurry shot of him and Maris walking through the hotel lobby. Ivy had collected every detail, not to expose him, but to understand him. I used to wait for your calls, she said. I used to think silence meant you were busy. Now I know it meant you were gone. Maris shifted uncomfortably. She hadn't expected this. She had agreed to the trip, thinking it would be a quiet retreat, a break from the noise. But now, the noise had followed them. Leonard reached for the remote, but the screen didn't respond. The stream was playing on every device in the suite. Even his phone, which he had turned off earlier, lit up with notifications. Ivy's message was everywhere. I'm not here to shame you, she continued. I'm here to speak, because silence taught me how to listen, and listening taught me how to speak. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Leonard felt it in his chest, a slow tightening that made it hard to breathe. He had built his life on control, controlling his image, his business, his relationships. But now, control was slipping away. Maris walked over and sat beside him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said enough. She was seeing a side of Leonard she hadn't known. Not the successful man in tailored suits, but a father who had walked away. The stream shifted to a video clip. Ivy was sitting in a small room, surrounded by books and papers. She looked calm, focused. She spoke about memories, birthdays missed, school events unattended, quiet dinners with just her and her mother. You taught me how to be strong, she said, but strength without connection is just distance. Leonard leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the screen. He remembered those moments. He remembered choosing meetings over milestones, silence over conversation. He had convinced himself it was necessary. Now, he wasn't so sure. Outside, the sky was turning dark. The sea reflected the fading light, and the waves grew louder. Inside, the stream continued. I'm not asking for anything, Ivy said. I just wanted you to hear me, because sometimes being heard is enough. The screen faded to black. The room was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind Leonard had wanted, but the kind that follows truth. He stood up slowly and walked to the window. Maris stayed seated, her gaze fixed on the blank screen. Leonard looked out at the sea, the same sea he had hoped would wash away everything. But the echoes from home had reached him, and they weren't going away. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Ivy would ever speak to him again. But he knew one thing: she had spoken, and he had listened. and sometimes that's where healing begins. The night air at Rosevale Manor was still, but inside the hotel, Leonard Hale felt anything but calm. The stream had ended hours ago, yet its words echoed in his mind. Ivy's voice, her steady tone, her quiet strength, none of it faded. The silence he had once craved now felt like a punishment. He sat alone in the garden behind the hotel, surrounded by trimmed hedges and soft lantern light. Maris Fern had gone back to the room without speaking. She had watched the stream with him, seen the truth unfold, and now kept her distance. Leonard didn't blame her. He barely understood himself. His phone buzzed again. He had turned it off earlier, but now it was back on, flooded with messages. News outlets had picked up Ivy's stream. Social media was filled with clips, quotes, and reactions. Guests at the hotel whispered his name. He had come here to disappear, but now he was trending. He scrolled through the headlines. Daughter exposes millionaire's secret getaway. Truth streamed live from home. Silence broken in real time. Each one felt like a mirror, showing him what he had become. Not a father, not a husband, but a story. He looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, hidden behind clouds. The garden was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm. He remembered Ivy as a child, her laughter, her questions, her drawings on the kitchen wall. He had missed so much. He had chosen distance, thinking it was easier. Now he saw the cost. Maris appeared at the edge of the garden. She didn't sit down. She just stood there, watching him. "You didn't tell me," she said softly. Leonard nodded. "I didn't tell anyone." "Why?" He paused. "I thought silence would protect me." Maris looked away. It didn't. They stood there for a moment, the space between them filled with unspoken thoughts. Maris had joined him on this trip, believing it was a fresh start. Now she saw it was an escape. "I didn't know she'd do this," Leonard said. "She didn't do it to hurt you," Maris replied. "She did it to be heard." He knew she was right. Ivy hadn't shouted. She hadn't accused. She had spoken with clarity, with purpose. She had turned silence into strength. Leonard walked back toward the hotel. Maris followed, but kept her distance. Inside, the lobby was quieter than before. The staff avoided eye contact. The guests glanced his way, then looked down. The stream had changed everything. Back in the suite, the television was off, but the silence was louder than ever. Leonard sat down and opened his laptop. He searched for Ivy's name. Her stream had been shared by thousands. Comments poured in, some supportive, some curious, some critical, but most were moved by her calm honesty. He clicked on the replay. Ivy sat in a small room, her hands folded, her eyes steady. She spoke again, and the words felt new, even though he had heard them before. "I'm not here to expose," she said. "I'm here to express." Leonard watched the entire stream again. This time, he didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He listened. When it ended, he closed the laptop and sat in silence. Maris had gone to the other room. He didn't follow. He needed time. The unraveling had begun not with a fight, but with a voice. Ivy had taken the silence he gave her and turned it into something powerful. She had shown the world that truth doesn't need volume. It needs courage. Leonard looked out the window. The sea was calm again. The waves moved slowly, like deep breaths. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if Ivy would ever speak to him in person. But he knew one thing. He had been heard. And sometimes, being heard is the beginning of change. The morning was quiet as Leonard Hale stepped off the train. The station was nearly empty, and the air smelled of fresh coffee and old stone. He carried no luggage, just a folded coat over his arm and a phone that hadn't rung in days. The journey back had been long, not in distance, but in thought. He had left behind the sea, the hotel, and the silence he once believed would protect him. The streets of his hometown looked the same, but felt different. Shops were opening, people were walking dogs, and the world moved on as if nothing had changed. But for Leonard, everything had. Ivy's stream had reached millions. Her voice had echoed far beyond the hotel walls. And now, he was walking through the same streets he used to rush through, this time with no meetings to attend and no calls to answer. He passed the bookstore where Ivy used to sit after school, reading quietly in the corner. He remembered buying her a notebook once, telling her to write her own stories. She had smiled, but he hadn't stayed long enough to hear what she wrote. Now, her story had reached the world, and he had listened to every word. He turned the corner and saw the small cafe where Ivy had worked part-time. The windows were fogged from the morning steam, and the sign above the door was still slightly crooked. He stepped inside. The warmth hit him immediately. Fresh bread, soft music, and the quiet hum of conversation. The barista looked up but didn't react. Leonard nodded politely and walked to the counter. There was no one behind it, just a small note taped to the surface. It was written in Ivy's handwriting, neat and clear. You don't need to reply, just listen. Beneath the message was a small drawing of a microphone, the same one she had used during her stream. Leonard stared at it for a long moment. He didn't touch the note. He didn't take a photo. He simply stood there, letting the words settle. He sat down at a corner table, the same one Ivy used to choose. The chair creaked slightly as he leaned back. Outside, the sun was rising slowly, casting soft light across the pavement. Inside, the cafe was calm. No cameras, no screens, no noise, just quiet. He thought about everything that had happened. The flight, the hotel, the stream. Maris had left without saying goodbye. The silence between them had grown too wide. Leonard didn't chase her. He understood. Some departures don't need explanations. He thought about Ivy's words. She hadn't asked for forgiveness. She hadn't demanded anything. She had spoken with strength, with clarity, and with purpose. She had turned silence into a message, and that message had reached him. He looked around the cafe. A young couple laughed near the window. An older man read the newspaper. Life continued. But for Leonard, something had shifted. ... He wasn't the same man who had boarded that plane weeks ago. He wasn't the same man who had blocked his family and disappeared. He was someone who had been seen. He stood up slowly and walked to the counter again. The note was still there. He didn't take it. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded once, as if to say, "I heard you." Outside, the streets were brighter now. He walked without rushing, without checking his phone. He passed the school Ivy had attended, the park where she had learned to ride her bike, and the corner where she had once waited for him to pick her up. He had missed those moments. But now, he remembered them. The return wasn't dramatic. There were no speeches, no reunions. Just quiet steps, honest thoughts, and the beginning of something new. Leonard didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if Ivy would ever sit across from him again. But he knew one thing. He had listened, and sometimes, listening is the first step toward healing. The silence he once paid for had taught him nothing, but the voice he tried to ignore had taught him everything. And that was the real return. Not to a place, but to a truth. And that was the story of a man who tried to escape the noise, only to be found by the one voice he couldn't ignore. Sometimes the truth doesn't chase. It waits to be heard. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.